I saw something in 2014 that changed me. I only recently learned it has a name. Original report by Schleek, with further research and edits by The Facts and Fiction. Night drive footage generously provided by Jade Widow Drives. Hey, glad you could make it. Hope your week's been as good as it could be. I know it's been pretty rough out there for a lot of us, but I am really glad to see you, and I'm ready to take my mind off this crazy world we live in and focus instead on, well, I guess still this crazy world we live in, but you know what I mean. I'm also glad that you're not worn out after our Halloween drive. I know you and some other friends have messaged me asking me about Roger and Naran. They're both doing well, though Roger recently has something slamming into his camper door at night and even jumping onto his roof. So I guess that's not great, but fine. He said he just bought a trail cam to try and catch whatever is doing it in the act, so expect another drive with a full update on that soon. Naran was happy to have someone take his story seriously, and even has an interesting story about his grandmother's goat being possessed by a mountain god. I definitely want more details on that story for you soon as well. Today though, I wanted to tackle a topic that's been on my mind since we started these drives, and honestly one I've been fascinated with since I was a kid. But I've been hesitant to try and cover it for a number of reasons. I'll talk about those reasons briefly, but perhaps against my better judgment, I figured today I'd tell you about skinwalkers. Now, first and foremost, I want to be clear about a few things. When we talked about the Wendigo during our last drive before Halloween, I told you that it's always felt a bit gross to me to take something with potentially thousands of years of cultural, social, or even religious significance, and reduce it down to nothing but a cheap TikTok jump scare, where some guy in a bodysuit jumps out of the trees and scares the bejesus out of some 11-year-old with a camera. Don't get me wrong, jump scares are funny, but these stories have always felt like they deserve more respect than that, and carry much deeper meanings than just boogeyman in the woods. Long story short, there is a ton of misinformation out there on Wendigos, or in this case, skinwalkers. And I don't want to contribute to that misinformation during these drives. But all of that said, I do have a story I've picked out that has a lot of the key behaviors and characteristics of an authentic skinwalker. And it feels at least reasonably authentic to the original Navajo depictions of this entity. And while I've gone back and forth ad nauseum on whether I should just save this story for a full breakdown on the skinwalker later, I think I've finally decided I'm okay telling you this story now, but on the condition that I can separate some facts from fiction on the topic first. I'll keep this part brief and save most of the gory details, no pun intended, for our deep dive on the topic. But for now, let me tell you briefly about what a skinwalker isn't, what it is, and then we'll jump into Steven's story. So, what a skinwalker is not. Despite what TikTok might have you believe, a skinwalker is not just anything remotely spooky or paranormal going on in the woods. Very similar to what we talked about with the Wendigo. It's also not just anything that mimics humans' voices. And finally, they're not anything that looks sort of like an animal, but that's off somehow. Oh, and they're absolutely not the same thing as Wendigos, crawlers, rakes, etc., despite some surface-level similarities. But I think that goes without saying. Not only are there a ton of entirely mundane natural explanations for this kind of dollar store creepypasta, mockingbirds, bored teenagers, and outright hoaxes all come to mind. There are multiple specific cultural and supernatural details that all need to be met to make a Skinwalker a Skinwalker. So, what is a Skinwalker then? The Skinwalker's stories come from the Navajo or Dine people group that have most recently populated the Four Corners region of the southwest United States. Think the Wild West country of Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. The Dine themselves are considered part of the southern Athabascan peoples, with their northern counterparts living as far north as the boreal forests and tundras of northern Canada. Despite how ancient this connection is, however, it's evident in a ton of ways today. You can even see it highlighted in the very names the northern and southern groups use to describe themselves. The southern group, people we generally call the Navajo, refer to themselves as the Dine, which means the people. And the northern group? They call themselves the Dene, which means, well, the people. And while I do think that this extensive shared history is really fascinating and something that I want to explore in further detail later, we're going to be focusing on how these stories relate to the southern peoples and their depictions of skinwalkers. As for what these skinwalkers can do, in short, a skinwalker is a medicine man who has been corrupted, forsaking his duties of healing and guiding the people, and instead using his supernatural abilities for his own fulfillment. Historically, they're described as being born of necessity. During the Spanish and American Wars of Eradication on the Dine, and they largely rose to prominence when their gods granted these medicine men the ability to don the skin of any animal and adopt its form. These medicine men would then use this power to slip behind enemy lines, spy on troop movements, conduct guerrilla warfare, and help stave off the wholesale eradication of the people. After these wars, however, some of these men did not want to give up their power, and so they fell to corruption and the ways of dark magic to retain it. And while their ability to assume animal form remained largely the same, their powers for healing were more or less converted to powers of sickness, destruction, cursed luck, and even death. Of particular note is that Southern Dene medicinal magic is actually rooted to and drawn from 4 sacred mountains within the broader Four Corners area. These mountains were given to them by their gods, and their gods channel their power through the mountains to the medicine men. While this allows the medicine men to draw from enormous wells of power, it also means the farther one travels from these lands, the more their connection and power would wane. And this limitation allegedly applies to those who practice dark medicine as well. It also bears mentioning that this story takes place in Ohio, and that could be a pretty heavy strike against its authenticity. That said, there are also a number of accounts that suggest the method by which skinwalkers acquire their power is not rooted in the land and the earth itself, but instead in acts of extreme depravity and evil. I won't get into the details of what these dark rituals might entail, at least not on this drive, but it's possible that the sacrifice serves as a twofold blasphemy. One, which severs the medicine man from their connection to the 4 sacred mountains and the magic of the gods, and another, which rebinds them to magic via an entirely dark, corrupt conduit. Theoretically, this might allow them to practice dark magic beyond the geographical confines they once were restricted to, but I need to emphasize that while I feel like some of what I found suggests this, I'm far from able to confirm it, and it's something I want to address fully in our deep dive on the topic later. So, whether it's possible or not for a skinwalker to operate outside of the reach of these 4 sacred mountains, I should say that if it is possible, it's extremely rare, as the vast majority of skinwalker reports, or at least reports that are authentic to the historical depiction of skinwalkers, they come from the southwest region of the United States within traditional Navajo lands, and within range of the 4 sacred mountains. There's a lot more I want to tell you about the history and culture and beliefs that all go into this, and a lot more questions I have as well. But I think that pretty well summarizes what a Skinwalker actually is, at least enough to give context for the story. So, without further ado, let me tell you about Stephen and the Logan County Skinwalker. Hey, my name is Stephen. I'm in my mid-20s and have lived my entire life in Logan County, Ohio. And this is the first of what would become many future experiences with a being that my cousin and I have come to believe is a Skinwalker. This story happened about 4 years ago. It's late fall of 2018 at the time of writing. I live in a pretty rural area and spend most of my time outdoors. So honestly, I didn't even have a name for what I saw until just recently. I was actually listening to a story on Corpse Husband's YouTube channel when he told a story that was eerily similar to my own experience, and the story was about a Skinwalker. The description he gave so closely mirrored what I had seen that I immediately looked up the name, and, well, after reading numerous other encounters associated with it, it matches what we saw perfectly. I saw them multiple times after my first encounter, but interestingly enough, I only needed to deal with them on our property for a few years, as in 2016, I encountered something much bigger and badder than a Skinwalker, something that I think is keeping them at bay. But this story first. I grew up on a shared plot of land that has been passed down through my family for generations. There's an open stretch of land about 150 yards or so between my house and my cousin's house, and both houses back up to some of our fields and then eventually borders onto a huge area of undeveloped forest and wildland. Our property is about 2.5 square miles, so it's pretty big, and it has multiple fields and even a creek, in addition to our own little section of forest. Since it's a shared plot of family land and over 10 miles from the edge of the nearest town, all of our neighbors are either family themselves or a few very close family friends who have lived out here for as long as we have. One of the benefits of this is that growing up, we always had our cousins just next door to play around with, and all of the woods outdoors we could ever want to explore. One day, my cousin and I decided it was a nice summer night, so we were going to camp in our yard. I grabbed the tent we had in my parents' garage and we spent the evening setting it up before walking back to his house for dinner. At around 9 p.m. it was getting pretty dark out, so we decided to walk back to our tent so we wouldn't have to do so in complete darkness. There wasn't really much we could or needed to do physically in the tent with how dark it was, so we sat back and started talking about our plans for summer. We talked for a few hours, and around 11 p.m. or so, I got a call from my then-girlfriend. She was pretty upset about something that had happened earlier in the day, and I was pretty tired, so it took me a while to actually understand what she was saying and to calm her down. When I finally rubbed my brain cells together and figured it out, we continued to chat for a bit until my cousin grabbed my shoulder. Hard. I turned my head a bit and gave him a confused look, telling him I was on the phone, obviously, and he could wait. But rather than back off, he just pulled me around to look at him. His face was completely pale, eyes dilated almost comically, a single finger held to his lips in a desperate, terrified attempt to get me to shut up. The moment I saw his face, I whispered to my girlfriend that I had to go and hung up the phone. He stood there with his finger to his mouth as I dropped the phone on my sleeping bag, and before I could even ask him what was wrong, he mouthed to me, "Look," tilting his head towards the entrance of the tent. I moved in a half-crouch over to the tent door, careful not to step on any of the candy wrappers or soda cans strewn about our tent. Making it to the door, I unzipped the door flap an inch or two and looked out into the darkness. straining my eyes to try and see what had startled him so thoroughly. When nothing out of the ordinary magically appeared, I let out a half-annoyed laugh. Dude, what the heck? Before I was interrupted by the sound of human footsteps darting in towards the tent, almost in response to my voice. I froze in place as the gravity of the situation shattered over me. Our property is over 10 miles outside even the edge of town, and the houses that live closest to us belong to either family or old family friends. We've always been totally safe on our property and have never once had an issue with someone trespassing, causing trouble, or, hell, even a door-to-door salesman due to how isolated we are. All that to say, the only person who should be out here is my dad, and he's never been the type of person to prank anyone. My eyes shot over to my cousin, and I held my hand to my lips, pointing down to the ground, indicating for him to stay down as I turned back to the entrance to see if I could find who or what was approaching. I gently pulled back the top corner of the tent door, just enough to peek through again, and nothing. When that same nothing continued for what felt like an excessive amount of time, I inevitably started to rationalize the sounds, assuming whoever it was just ran off, or that maybe it was simply my dad coming out to check on us. Before I could really question how I would hear someone run up to the tent but not away, or why my dad would not have simply called out and said something by now, the sheer stupidity of my rationalization evaporated as I heard the footsteps darting through the leaves again. Too scared to move to my sleeping bag and potentially make noise, I crouched by the tent door for what felt like hours as I listened to the footsteps. At first, they sounded like someone quickly moving through the leaves, but then they stopped and were followed by a smaller, scurrying sound, as if whoever this was had scared an animal in the underbrush as they circled our tent. Then, from somewhere else outside of the tent, they would start up again, with this slow, deliberate, almost prowling walk, all while making their way closer and closer to our tent. My legs were burning in agony from crouching so long, and I remember wondering if I could adjust just a bit to relieve the pressure now burning in my thighs. The footsteps were still circling in, but the pain in my legs was getting excruciating and was only getting worse. I forced myself to stay still until my legs literally started to tremble from being forced to support me in this half-crouch for so long. I knew if I didn't find a way to adjust my position soon, they would give out and adjust for me. So, I leaned back as carefully as I could and shifted some weight onto one arm. The relief in my legs was instant, and I had to stop myself from letting out a sigh of relief. Then, leaning back slightly further and bending my elbow so I could rest on my entire forearm, I heard the horrible, familiar crunch of a candy wrapper as I squished it against the tent fabric beneath me. The footsteps instantly stopped. Frozen in a half-crouched, half-falling backwards position, with one arm on the ground holding me up and my chest facing the door, I felt everything freeze around me. It honestly felt like one of those horrible nightmares where you're pushed out naked onto a stage and expected to perform a part in a play you've never heard of. Or when you call in sick to work on a Friday night and then see your boss standing in another concession line at the movie theater. I was completely frozen in fear. No idea if I should hide or if moving more would just draw more attention to myself, but I guess instinct took over, and I looked towards the gap in the top of the tent door. I finally saw what had freaked my cousin out so much. Two long, bony fingers covered in dirt, or what almost seemed like engine grease, slipped back from the now substantially wider gap in the tent door. Behind them, a glowing golden disc about the size of my thumb flicked back and forth in the darkness, before drifting back and away from the opening. A second disc quickly joined the first, and they slowly drifted up together away from the tent, before coming to a rest at about head height. My stomach dropped as I was hit with a wave of nausea, almost as if my body were revolting at what my brain and eyes were trying to process. Head height, 2 glowing orbs, fingers sticking through the door gap. Head height. The same stupidly rational part of my brain that tried to convince me this was my dad before, now kicked into full overdrive, trying to convince me this is not what I was seeing. These are just weird discs, lightning bugs, a trick of the light. The human-shaped silhouette in the darkness is not a human, it's a shadow. The discs aren't eyes, the shadow isn't a person, the eyes aren't eyes, the person isn't a person. The tall, lanky figure of a man staring down at me from the entrance to my tent was not a tall, lanky figure of a man staring down at me from the entrance of my tent. Then the figure, this person my mind insisted it wasn't, took a step back from the tent and into just enough of the moonlight that I could start to make out his details, silencing once and for all the desperate part of my mind that simply wanted me to believe I was hallucinating. It was a man. He was almost completely naked except for a few matted animal skins that he wore draped across his back and shoulders. His skin was dark, but not in a way where it seemed like it was his natural skin color. It almost seemed like he was coated in ash or engine grease or mud, with small patches of lighter skin breaking through the dark smudges. As the trees swayed in the wind, their shadows moved across his face, and whenever the moon would catch it, his eyes would flare up, glowing even more intensely, like an animal's eyes would shine if you pointed a light or held high beams from a semi-truck at them. But even in the darkness, his eyes still shone way too brightly to make out an eye color or pupils, really, and the faint moonlight alone was way too dim to have made them glow like that naturally. I honestly have no idea how long I stayed like that, eyes locked, frozen in complete terror as this thing stared at us. It could have been a few minutes or it could have been hours. My tunnel vision was so intense I forgot my cousin was even there, and I just stared at this thing like if I even blinked I would never see anything again. And then he just walked away. He didn't say anything. He didn't do anything aggressive. He just calmly and slowly stepped backwards into the darkness, the flickering glow of his eyes slowly shrinking until he reached the trees about 20 feet away. Then he turned around and ran off towards the thicker part of our forest. I stayed awake for over an hour, all the while straining my ears for any sound indicating he was coming back. I remember hearing the first sounds of the earliest birds starting to stir in the trees, before the terror and exhaustion must have just overwhelmed me, and I passed out. The sound of birds and insects, now in full activity, tore me from the complete oblivion I had fallen into. My mind and body feeling sluggish at first as my brain turned on and remembered I even existed. It was full morning. The sun had already risen, and I jolted up as the memories of the night before came crashing down on me. There was a sound of movement to my right, and I jumped, turning quickly to see Jack, who apparently had been startled by me. We stared at each other with the same question on both of our minds. And without saying a word, we scrambled out of the tent to inspect our surroundings. If we were lucky, we would find nothing, and the stupid rational part of my brain assured me we could then convince ourselves we'd simply been seeing things, whipping ourselves into a frenzy the night before. We hadn't gone 2 steps out of the tent door before that desperate hope was dashed. As there, in the soft dirt surrounding our tent, was a bare set of human footprints. Well, mostly. The footsteps circled the tent over and over again, seemingly started from farther out in the field before drawing in close. I'd be lying if I said the word shark didn't cross my mind as we retraced this man's steps. That same stupidly rational part of my mind that had insisted on jumping to stupid conclusions now 4, 5 times, it decided it would have one more go, I guess. As despite how disconcerting it was to have a strange naked man prowling about our property at night and peeping Tom on a few teenagers camping out in their backyard, that was at least explainable. This final attempt at convincing me I was overreacting, misremembering, or dreaming, however, it didn't last long. We spent the better part of 2 hours carefully retracing the footprints that circled our tent. They started in the tree line and slowly spiraled in, forming tighter and tighter circles as they approached our camp, before starting in a straight line to cover that last 10 or so feet. The tracks then stopped directly in front of our tent, just close enough for a man to lean over, stick his fingers through the small gap in a tent door, and open it so he could look in. The steps then moved backwards from our tent, all the way up to the tree line where they turned and ran in a straight line off through one of our fields. Everything we could see added up perfectly with what we had seen and heard last night. But the thing that finally put the stupid rational part of my mind to rest, as we retraced the man's steps, we noticed several sections of track that seemed off. First, at a few points as he circled our camp. Then a few more along the tracks running off into the small section of woods around our campsite. But the most prominent example of this was the section of tracks that led away from our cornfield towards the forest beyond. The man was clearly running at this point. We could see that clearly as with each step, the footprints spaced wider and dug deeper into the soft dirt. And there, mid-stride, in broad daylight, we finally saw his footprints changing. At first, I almost wondered if he had stumbled and caught himself, leaving a series of short, half footprints at weird angles. This was only reaffirmed when we saw the first handprint in the dirt, and I let out a nervous laugh as I imagined this person who had terrified us so much, sprinting half naked through our cornfield, tripping, and almost face-planting in the dirt like a normal-ass person. Then we saw the second handprint, then the third, and then the fourth. And then the familiar steps of a human running through the loose dirt between rows of corn, well, changed to the much more awkward gait of someone running, sprinting on all fours. These footprints, and now handprints, continued on in a weird, staggered pattern, like a horse when it's galloping, but with human hands and feet instead of horseshoes. And then they began to shrink. In the course of maybe 20 feet or so, they went from the awkward, stumbling pattern of a human galloping on all fours to what almost looked like the hands and feet of a toddler, doing their weird, straight-legged crawl with both hands and feet. The hand and footprints grew smaller and smaller, and they were finally replaced by a lazy, unlabored track of coyote prints.